The jungle of Velmara was alive, humming with an energy that could make any seasoned hunter's blood run cold. The trees towered high above, their trunks twisting like living serpents, while glowing, bioluminescent flowers pulsed with soft, eerie light. Strange creatures skittered across the canopy, their movements fluid and almost too quick to follow, but it was the Xal'theron they were hunting that commanded the true fear of this landscape. A shrill scream echoed through the dense foliage. The students stumbled back, their eyes wide with panic, clutching their weapons in a futile attempt to ward off the encroaching terror. They had only been tracking the creature for 2 days, but the jungle had already taken its toll. Equipment was malfunctioning, nerves were fraying, and the weight of their professor's cold expectations hung over them like a constant, suffocating presence. "Focus!" The professor's voice rang through their comms, a sharp, insectoid hiss that cut through the chaos. Xeric, the professor, was no ordinary educator. His species, a towering insectoid race, was one of the oldest and most respected in the galaxy. To him, failure was an anomaly, a dishonor to his species' commitment to intellectual dominance. And failure was something he would not tolerate. "This is your test," Xeric continued, the words a grim promise: capture the Xal'theron or be left behind. In the foreground, Dain Carter, the lone human cadet in this group, barely flinched at the professor's command. His peers, the reptilian Rylos, a calculating strategist, and Vectra, an avian with telekinetic abilities, glanced at him, exchanging silent looks. To them, Dain was little more than an anomaly, a primitive, weak creature. He had no place in their world of superior intellect and deadly power. Yet here he was, forced to prove himself in this deadly game. Dain's only advantage, if one could call it that, was his alienness. Unlike the others, he wasn't weighed down by centuries of academic tradition, nor did he carry the same ego that came with having perfected every weapon and technology known to their species. He wasn't here to impress, only to survive. The jungle seemed to grow heavier as they pressed on, a silence hanging thick in the air. The humidity clung to their skin, sweat beading under their helmets. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the dense foliage and the damp, spongy ground. Dain's pulse quickened. The air smelled of something wrong, but the others were too focused on the task at hand to notice. Vectra, with her keen telekinetic senses, was the first to break the silence. "I sense it," she said, her voice steady, though her feathers ruffled with tension. "It's close." They fell into a tense silence as they scanned the environment, each of them listening for the telltale signs of the Xal'theron's presence. The crackling of branches under its massive weight, the soft thrumming of its bioelectric pulses. But there was nothing. "Move," Rylos barked, his voice tight with impatience. "It won't wait for us to find it." Dain nodded, his hands gripping the energy rifle slung across his back. His gut churned with unease, but he didn't speak. He simply moved with them, letting the cacophony of alien sounds wash over him, tuning his senses to the strange, shifting rhythms of the jungle. His instincts screamed at him to stop, to listen more carefully, but the others were already ahead, cutting through the undergrowth with mechanical precision. The tension in the air grew thick. Something was wrong. There was an oppressive silence, an absence that Dain couldn't quite place. His training on Earth had taught him to read nature's signs, and everything in his being screamed that the hunt wasn't going as planned. "I see it." Vectra's voice was sharp with sudden realization. Dain's head snapped up, his eyes darting to the distant trees as they parted. Through the shadows, a hulking silhouette emerged. The Xal'theron was an apex predator, its form sleek yet muscular, its dark scales blending seamlessly with the shadows of the jungle. It was like nothing Dain had ever seen, an amalgamation of the fiercest creatures across the galaxy, yet with a level of intelligence that made it more dangerous than any animal he had encountered. The creature's eyes glowed a deep red, and as it locked onto the group, it snarled, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. Dain's heart skipped a beat, but he stood firm, his gaze unwavering. "Shit," Rylos muttered, his voice barely audible. He raised his weapon, his hand trembling slightly. It's too fast. Before they could react, the creature lunged. Its speed was nothing short of terrifying, its body a blur of motion, a predator in its purest form. Vectra's telekinetic shields flared to life, but the Xal'theron was already on them, its claws raking through the force fields like they were made of paper. Rylos fired. The plasma round struck the creature's hide, but it didn't even flinch. Instead, it howled, a sound so primal and bone-chilling that it sent a jolt of fear through Dain's chest. The beast twisted, and in the blink of an eye, it closed the distance, swinging its massive tail like a battering ram, knocking Rylos off his feet. Dain's mind raced. The others were scrambling, panicking. Vectra's feathers were frayed, her concentration fractured by the beast's overwhelming presence. She lifted her hands, trying to form another shield, but her telekinesis was faltering under the Xal'theron's sheer might. "Form a circle," Dain barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Don't let it separate us." Rylos staggered to his feet, his claws scraping against the wet earth. "Are you mad? It's too strong. We can't fight it head-on," Dain said, more to himself than to them. His mind spun as he scanned the jungle around them. The creature was a beast of instinct, but it wasn't just hunting them. It was studying them, learning. "It doesn't want to kill us right away," he muttered. "It's testing us." Vectra's eyes narrowed, her telekinetic power crackling. "You're saying it's playing with us?" "I think so," Dain replied, his voice calm, despite the adrenaline surging through him. "And if we don't stop reacting, it's going to tear us apart." There was a beat of silence. Dain took a slow, deliberate step forward towards the beast. The others froze, confusion flashing across their faces. "What are you doing?" Vectra whispered, her telekinesis wavering. Dain didn't answer. He didn't even look back. His focus was solely on the Xal'theron, its glowing eyes locked onto him as it crouched, its body rippling with energy. He moved closer until he was within arm's reach of the creature, his heart pounding in his chest. The Xal'theron growled, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the air. But Dain didn't flinch. He stood still, not as prey, but as something else. Slowly, carefully, he extended his hand, palm facing the creature, not in challenge, but in invitation. The Xal'theron's head tilted, its gaze piercing through him. There was a moment of stillness, as if time itself had frozen. The jungle held its breath. And then, impossibly, the creature stopped. Its muscles relaxed, its snarling ceased. For a split second, it looked almost confused. Dain didn't move. He remained calm, focused, his hand outstretched, as though offering peace instead of war. "I'm not your enemy," he whispered, his voice steady. A ripple of tension passed through the others as they watched, utterly perplexed by what was happening. But in that moment, they saw something change. The Xal'theron wasn't just a mindless killing machine. It was something more, a creature of immense power, but with a mind that could be reasoned with. The predator's posture softened. It wasn't submission. Not exactly, but it was an acknowledgement. Dain held its gaze, waiting, his breath slow, and even he took a small step back. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. They weren't done yet. The jungle, thick with humidity, was a web of shadows and neon flashes, twisting and shuddering with the breath of creatures unseen. The Xal'theron, still crouching before Dain, stared into his eyes as if weighing the merit of his offer. The tension in the air was palpable, heavy enough to drown out even the distant rustling of foliage. Dain stood motionless, his hand extended towards the creature, a silent plea for calm in the midst of a storm. Vectra, the telekinetic avian, had her hands held tightly by her sides, her eyes wide with disbelief. Her feathers ruffled uneasily. She glanced at Rylos, whose reptilian face twisted into a snarl as he hefted his weapon. "What the hell is he doing?" Vectra's voice cracked through the silence, her focus still divided between the creature and the human who had stepped into its danger zone. "I don't know," Rylos muttered, his hand still gripping the hilt of his plasma rifle. "But if he gets himself killed, it's on him." The Xal'theron shifted slightly, its massive form rippling with muscles that seemed to defy natural limits. The creature's crimson eyes flickered between Dain and the other students, as if gauging their reactions. It moved cautiously, almost curiously, though still keeping its lethal talons coiled by its sides, ready to strike. For a moment, nothing happened. The jungle, once alive with the sounds of danger, fell silent as if nature itself was holding its breath. Then, with a strange whirring sound, the creature's neck twisted, and it dropped down onto its haunches, an unnatural stillness overtaking its body. It was not the submission Dain had expected, at least not in the traditional sense. Instead, the Xal'theron regarded him with an unreadable intelligence, its awareness of him expanding beyond the simple predator-prey relationship. Dain took another small step forward, his hand still extended, not in challenge, but an invitation to understanding. "What's happening?" Rylos asked, his voice a low growl. Vectra's eyes darted from the creature to Dain, the look on her face a mix of confusion and wariness. She stepped closer to Dain, but hesitated before speaking. "You're saying this beast, will just stop because you want it to?" Dain didn't take his eyes off the Xal'theron. "It's not about wanting it to stop," he said slowly. "It's about understanding it. It's a predator, but it's also something else. It's not just hunting us, it's testing us. It's trying to figure us out. And if we don't react the way it expects, maybe we can show it that we're not just prey." Rylos scoffed. "And you think that will work? You think it won't tear you apart the second you drop your guard?" Dain didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lowered his hand slowly, never breaking eye contact with the Xal'theron. There was a heartbeat of stillness before the creature's intense gaze softened ever so slightly. Dain allowed the silence to stretch, trusting in his instincts and the ancient bond between man and beast, even if he couldn't fully explain it. Vectra moved cautiously toward Dain, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is madness. Is it?" Dain replied, his voice steady. "Sometimes it's not about brute force. Sometimes the answer is understanding what you're dealing with." Just then, the Xal'theron made an almost imperceptible movement. It was a subtle shift, but enough to catch Dain's attention. A low rumble vibrated in the ground beneath them, the creature's posture changing, a more curious tilt of its head as if considering Dain's actions. Its claws flexed, and it took a single, tentative step forward. "Shit," Rylos muttered. He started to raise his weapon again, but Vectra stopped him with a hand on his arm. "No," she said sharply. "Don't make it worse. He's not fighting it. He's trying to talk to it. We have to trust him." Rylos growled, but didn't lower his weapon. He wasn't sure if it was trust he felt for Dain, or just the fear of the unknown. He had seen many creatures, many forms of combat, but never had he witnessed something so bizarre. To approach the Xal'theron as though it were simply another obstacle to overcome felt wrong. Everything about this creature screamed danger, and yet here they stood, watching as Dain tried to negotiate peace with a beast that had taken down entire teams of students before. The Xal'theron's head shifted again, and this time it made a sound. It wasn't a growl, but something between a hum and a chittering noise, as if it was communicating. Dain couldn't place it, but the longer he stood there, the more certain he became. The creature was trying to understand him. "Why does it care about us?" Vectra whispered, all creeping into her voice. "Why does it listen to him?" "I don't know," Dain replied, keeping his voice calm. "Maybe it knows we're not just here to kill it. Maybe it knows we're not like the others." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, the jungle seemed to hold its breath. Then, suddenly, the Xal'theron snapped its head towards a distant rustle in the bushes. A warning. It wasn't looking at Dain anymore. It was searching for something or someone else. Rylos's grip tightened on his weapon. "It's not done. It's still hunting." But Dain's eyes never left the creature. "It's not hunting us. Not anymore." He wasn't sure how he knew, but the beast had stopped seeing them as prey. For the first time, it was simply aware of them. It was no longer the feral, mindless killer that Xeric had warned them about. It was something different, something more. Dain moved cautiously, his voice soft. "It's not the creature we need to be afraid of anymore. It's him." Vectra blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" Before Dain could respond, a sudden, sharp crack split the air, a sound that sent a chill down their spines. It was followed by the unmistakable hum of high-powered weaponry. The signal. The countdown. Xeric's voice boomed in their comms, calm and chilling as always. Enough. This test has gone on long enough. Kill the Xal'theron, or I will. The silence in the jungle shattered. The Xal'theron's ears flicked as it heard the order, its massive form bristling with tension. It was no longer the creature in front of them, the curious, momentarily docile animal. It had been hunted once again. And this time, it wasn't going to wait to be trapped. "We need to move," Dain said quickly, his eyes narrowing as the creature tensed, its primal instincts waking once more. It's not playing anymore. It's scared. Rylos and Vectra hesitated, caught between their loyalty to Xeric's command and the unsettling reality before them. But Dain's words rang clear in their ears. They had underestimated him, and they had underestimated the creature. The real enemy was not the beast, but the system they were all bound to. The chase, the hunt, it was about proving supremacy, not survival. The Xal'theron's posture shifted as it bounded into the shadows, moving with a speed that defied logic. Dain took a deep breath and followed, pushing his fear to the back of his mind. Behind him, Rylos and Vectra fell in line, no longer questioning, but following. For the first time, they were united, not in fear of the creature, but in the realization that the true test was not the hunt itself, but what came after. And Xeric's deadly game was far from over. The jungle seemed to pulse with a life of its own as Dain and his team pressed deeper into the heart of the unknown. The underbrush thickened, the air heavy with moisture, and the sounds of the alien world intensified. But the creature, the Xal'theron, was gone, slipping into the darkness of the jungle, its presence felt only by the occasional shudder of the earth beneath their feet. For now, they had won a temporary reprieve. But the real danger was not the beast. It was the cold, calculating eyes of their professor, Xeric. "I told you it wouldn't just stop," Rylos muttered, his voice low, the words laced with something between frustration and awe. He gripped his weapon tighter, scanning the jungle around them. "You had no business doing what you did, human." Dain ignored the jab, his focus elsewhere. The Xal'theron was not the only threat here, and he knew it. They were all too focused on the hunt, on the creature, to see the bigger picture. The professor had made his intentions clear. Xeric would not let them leave until the test was complete, and failure was not an option. But the creature, that terrifying, powerful creature, had done something that no one had expected. It had listened. Vectra, her eyes still fixed on the path ahead, spoke, her voice sharp but tinged with uncertainty. "You're right, Dain. It didn't just react like we thought it would. But you saw it. It's not a monster. It's something else. It understood you." Dain nodded, but he wasn't sure if she truly understood. It wasn't just about communicating with the Xal'theron. It was about breaking down the barriers that the test had set up in the first place. Xeric wasn't testing their ability to kill. He was testing their ability to survive, but in a way that was more insidious. He was testing their ability to obey. They continued forward, silently now, the gravity of the situation settling over them like a thick fog. Even the towering trees, the strange flowers, the pulsing energy of the jungle seemed to pull back, as though it too was watching them. Dain's thoughts turned inward, each step bringing him closer to the realization that they were on the brink of something far more dangerous than the hunt for the Xal'theron. They were walking straight into Xeric's trap. Rylos broke the silence again, his voice tight with a barely contained anger. "That thing, that creature, if you hadn't stopped it, we'd have captured it already. You don't understand what's at stake." "I understand perfectly," Dain said evenly, not turning to face the others. His voice was calm, despite the storm brewing inside him. "We're not here to prove who's stronger. We're here to prove who's smarter." Vectra, whose telekinetic powers had been more erratic since their first encounter with the Xal'theron, glanced at him, skepticism written across her face. "Smarter? What do you mean by that?" "This is a test of strength, of skill. Xeric only respects the strongest." "Strength is overrated," Dain replied. What matters is survival. And for the first time, I think the Xal'theron realizes that. It's not an animal to be subdued. It's a creature that understands, just like us. If we can show it that we're not here to dominate it, maybe it'll work with us. Rylos snorted. Work with us? You're dreaming. The Xal'theron doesn't cooperate. It hunts. Then we need to change the game, Dain said, turning back to face his companions. And we're not going to do it by following Xeric's rules. We're going to do it our way. The words hung in the air for a moment, each of them absorbing the weight of the decision Dain had just made. They could go on, following Xeric's cruel command, risking everything in a game that had no winners, except for the professor. Or they could choose to make their own fate. But doing that meant defying everything they had been taught. Do you think Xeric will let us do that? Vectra asked, her voice quieter now, laced with a hint of doubt. Dain met her gaze. I don't care what Xeric thinks. He's not the one in control here. For a long, tense moment, there was only the sound of the jungle, the distant call of strange creatures, the rustling of the leaves as if the very air around them was waiting. Finally, Rylos lowered his weapon, a reluctant respect in his eyes. Fine, he muttered. We'll do it your way. But if this goes wrong, we're on our own. Vectra remained silent, her telekinetic power thrumming beneath her skin, still uncertain but willing to follow. It was the first time in the entire test that Dain felt they were finally, truly on the same side. Suddenly, a distant growl broke the quiet. The Xal'theron. It was close, much closer than before. But there was something different about its movement this time. It wasn't rushing. It wasn't charging. It was cautious. We need to move, Dain said, his voice urgent now. It's not hunting us anymore, but it's still out there, and it's still a threat. They moved quickly, keeping their senses sharp, following the faint trail the Xal'theron had left behind. They were no longer running blindly. Now, they were tracking the creature, but with the understanding that they weren't hunting it. It was hunting them in a different way. This was no longer about brute force. This was about strategy, about taking control of a situation that had always been outside their hands. As they pushed through the dense jungle, Dain felt the weight of his choices settle on his shoulders. They weren't just defying Xeric's expectations. They were defying everything they had ever been taught. Everything they had been told about the galaxy, about dominance, about survival. There was no room for weakness, no room for mercy. Or so they had been led to believe. But as Dain focused on the path ahead, he realized that perhaps mercy, perhaps understanding, was the true form of power. And perhaps, just perhaps, the Xal'theron was the key to proving it. Not just to the professor, but to everyone. The sound of the growl grew louder. The creature was close. But as Dain crouched, peering through the underbrush, he saw it. The Xal'theron, watching them from the shadows, waiting. But this time it wasn't attacking. It was observing. The jungle grew silent again. Time seemed to stretch as the creature stood motionless, its glowing red eyes locked on Dain. He took a deep breath, his hand still resting by the side of his rifle, but not raised. Not yet. He was waiting for something. Waiting for the Xal'theron to make the first move. Rylos's voice was low behind him, almost a whisper. You're doing this again? Yeah, Dain said, barely above a whisper. But this time we're going to make it listen. And in that moment, as the creature's gaze held his, Dain knew that the real test was not the hunt for dominance. It was whether they could make the universe listen to their understanding of strength, true strength. The Xal'theron shifted again, its eyes still locked on Dain. And for the first time in this deadly game, Dain felt something stir inside him, something primal, something ancient. They were more than prey, more than hunters. They were something in between, and it was time to prove it. The silence of the jungle was almost oppressive now, the weight of it pressing against them as they stood there in the shadows. Dain could hear his breath, ragged in his throat, but still he didn't move. The Xal'theron's crimson eyes gleamed in the darkness, its massive form barely visible but unmistakable. The creature was no longer the mindless predator that had attacked them earlier. It was waiting, watching. It was aware. For the first time in the entire test, Dain felt the clarity of purpose settle over him. He was no longer fighting to survive. He was fighting to change the rules. Behind him, he could hear Rylos and Vectra shifting uneasily, their presence a reminder that they were still trapped in this game of survival, this cruel mockery of a test. But it was more than that. They were being tested for their worth, not just by the creature, but by their professor, Xeric, a man who saw everything as a conquest, a challenge to be overcome by any means necessary. But Dain was no longer playing by those rules. "This is it," he whispered, barely loud enough for them to hear. "This is where we change everything." Rylos, the ever-distrustful one, scoffed. "Change everything? By what? Talking to it? You really think that's going to work?" Dain didn't respond. Instead, he took a step forward, his movements slow and deliberate, as if the Xal'theron were an old friend, not the killer they had first encountered. His mind raced, piecing together everything he had learned since the moment they set foot on this alien planet. The creatures, the testing grounds, the underlying game Xeric was playing, it was all a puzzle, and he had begun to see the patterns. Rylos muttered a curse under his breath, clearly ready to charge in with brute force, but Vectra's soft voice stopped him. "Let him try," she said. "We don't have anything left to lose." Dain didn't look back as he moved further into the clearing. The Xal'theron's gaze followed him, the creature's powerful body coiled, ready to strike. But it didn't. It stayed where it was, waiting. The air between them felt charged, like the moment before a storm. There was a thick tension hanging in the atmosphere, as if nature itself was holding its breath, uncertain of what would happen next. Dain held his ground, taking another slow, careful step forward. "We're not here to fight you," he called out softly, not to the creature, but to the air itself, to the ancient rhythm of the jungle around them. He wasn't sure what he expected the creature to do, but he knew he couldn't approach it like an enemy. That was what Xeric wanted, everything to be a war, a battle to dominate. The Xal'theron shifted its weight, its massive form rippling with muscle, but it didn't lunge. It was still, and then, with startling precision, it spoke. Not in words, but in a deep, resonating sound that vibrated through the ground beneath their feet, a low hum that reverberated in Dain's chest. It was something between a growl and a song, an unearthly noise that seemed to pull at the very fabric of the jungle around them. Rylos tensed, his fingers tightening on his weapon, but Vectra held him back with a glance. "Wait," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's trying to communicate." Dain's heart raced. This wasn't the violent roar he had expected. This wasn't the creature preparing to strike. This was something else. Something primal, yes, but not mindless. It was a warning, an invitation. He had been right. The Xal'theron had been testing them all along. And now, it was his turn to answer. "I'm not your enemy," Dain said again, his voice steady but filled with a kind of wonder. "We don't have to fight. We can work together." There was a beat of silence, and for a moment, Dain thought the creature might just turn and vanish into the jungle. But instead, the Xal'theron's eyes glowed brighter, and it let out another deep hum, this one more distinct, almost like a question. Dain took a deep breath, steadying himself. This was it. This was the moment. He had to prove that what he was saying was more than a hope. It had to be a truth that the creature could sense. He extended his hand toward the beast, fingers splayed, showing no threat. The Xal'theron's massive head tilted slightly to one side, a strange curiosity in its movements. It was considering him. It was listening. From behind him, he could feel Rylos's anger boiling over, but this time, Vectra's voice was a quiet anchor. "He's doing it," she murmured, almost in disbelief. "He's actually making it listen." Rylos growled under his breath, but he didn't move. For the first time since they'd arrived on this planet, he wasn't rushing into a fight. He was waiting to see what would happen. Dain's mind was racing, but his body was calm. He knew he couldn't rush this. The creature had to understand that they weren't threats. They were partners, allies in a way. And for that to happen, they had to communicate on a level beyond the violence that Xeric had instilled in them. The Xal'theron took a step forward, its massive claws pressing into the soft earth beneath it, each step deliberate, measured. The ground trembled slightly with the force of its movement. And then, to Dain's surprise, the creature lowered its head, bringing its face within mere inches of his outstretched hand. Dain didn't move. His breath held, his pulse thundering in his ears. He could feel the heat of the creature's breath, the scent of its wild energy. He was no longer looking at a monster. He was looking at a creature of intelligence, of purpose. And in that moment, something passed between them. Something ancient. Something that transcended the brutal games of survival they had been playing. And then a crackling sound echoed in the distance, and everything shifted. Dain's hand fell away from the Xal'theron as he turned toward the sound. It was the unmistakable hum of high-powered weaponry. Xeric. He didn't have time to think. The air around them seemed to warp with the sound of incoming fire. They weren't being hunted anymore. They were being trapped. Get back, Ryloth shouted, raising his weapon in a reflexive movement, but Vectra's telekinetic shield snapped into place, deflecting the first round of fire. The force of it pushed them back, but Dain didn't have time to react. He knew what had to be done. The Xal'theron, sensing the danger, let out a guttural roar, its muscles coiling as it prepared for a fight. But this wasn't the time to fight. This was the time to escape. Move, Dain shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. We're not fighting. We're leaving. They ran. The Xal'theron followed them, its massive body effortlessly gliding through the jungle, as if the ground itself bent to its will. Xeric's forces closed in, but it didn't matter anymore. The game had changed. As they broke through the trees and into the open, Dain felt the weight of what they had done. They had survived, not by brute force, not by following Xeric's rules, but by understanding the creature, by choosing a different path. For the first time since they had landed on this planet, Dain knew they had won. Not because they had outsmarted Xeric, but because they had done something no one expected. They had made peace with the unknown. And as they disappeared into the jungle's depths, the Xal'theron at their side, Dain allowed himself a quiet smile. They were more than just survivors now. They were something else entirely.